Hebrews chapter. So when I was involved in a house church, I used to say this is how we prepare for house church. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Say this is how we prepare for house church. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. And what I want to suggest that you do is you take that one another. So there's two verbs in that verse: consider and spur one another on. And I want to ask you to do this as you think about your involvement here at Grace. Is take that one another and shift it. Okay, move it from spur and move it over to consider. And so consider one another. Take a look at the people you're sitting around. We usually sit around the same people. Right? Consider one another. As you come and gather with God's people, consider each other. And consider each other as to how you can spur that person on towards love and good deeds. Just a little encouragement in terms of what we do in terms of the greeting. It's just a little kind of symbolic of what we desire for us as a body of believers to love one another, to care for each other, to consider each other. All right, now to our text. That's not the message. Proverbs chapter 22. Proverbs chapter 22, verses 7 to 14, page 934 if you're using the Bibles provided here in the church. Proverbs 22, verse 7 through 14. Page 934. So in our last message, we talked about desiring a good name. Many people want to make a name for themselves. But that's not what Proverbs is. Proverbs 22 verse 1 is talking about when it says, a good name is more desirable than great riches. A good name is what we have when we stand before God and we are commended by Him for a life well lived. As hard as it is for us to admit, most of us are more concerned about what other people think about us than we should be, right? Sometimes it ties us up in knots because of what other people think about us. And one of the ways we break free from that enslavement to what others think about us is by being more consumed by what God thinks of us. Be more consumed by what is the King of the universe think about us. In other words, we desire a good name in His presence. That's what we want. We want to have a good name in His presence and be consumed by that. And so if we desire that, then we have to adhere to the path of wisdom according to Proverbs, doing what is right and just and fair. And in this message, what I want us to do is just take a look at two areas where we need to stay faithful to the path of wisdom, where we need to keep on desiring a good name, and yet we're tempted to stray from that path, especially in the way we treat others. So Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7 to 14. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. Whoever sows injustice reaps calamity, and the rod they wield in fury will be broken. The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Drive out the mocker, and out goes strife. Quarrels and insults are ended. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king for a friend. The eyes of the Lord keep watch over knowledge, but He frustrates the words of the unfaithful. The sluggard says, there's a lion outside. I'll be killed in the public square. The mouth of an adulterous woman is a deep pit. A man who is under the Lord's wrath falls into it. So the two areas that we're going to explore this morning have to do with our wealth and our words. What are we doing with our money, and what are we saying with our mouths? So first of all, on wisdom's path, Right? So we want to keep on wisdom's path. We want to keep on desiring a good name. On wisdom's path, we are to be generous with our wealth. We're to be generous with our wealth. Tim Keller tells of a time when he did some talks on the 7 deadly sins. And his wife said to him, "I'll bet that the week you deal with greed, you will have the lowest attendance." And Keller writes this. He says, "She was right." Husbands, every once in a while, you got to say that. She was right. But he said she was right. People packed it out for lust. They packed it out for wrath and even for pride. But nobody thinks they are greedy. Nobody thinks they are greedy. Ram, have you ever had someone come to you and say, "Pastor, I have this terrible problem. I have too much money. I'm struggling with my lust for money." I bet you haven't. I bet you haven't. But the Bible makes a greater deal about greed than we often do. Think about this. When Jesus said, "You cannot serve 2 masters," and of all the idols that our hearts could produce, all the idols that our hearts could manufacture, what is the one master he picked? What is the one master he said? You cannot serve God and money. Mammon. Money. Proverbs raises the same concern about money. It says that the rich think their wealth is a fortified city. The rich think their wealth is a fortified city, but their trust in their riches will lead to their fall, lead to their ruin. And likewise, Proverbs 22, verses 7 to 9, is a warning about greed and how it can affect our use of money and our attitude about wealth and how we treat other people. Proverbs 22, verse 7 says, or shows us one of the realities about money and wealth in our world. It says, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender." And what that first part of the verse tells us is that the rich have power. They have power not just to buy things, not just power to do what they want, but they have the power to rule over others. They have the power to call the shots, to control the narrative of other people's lives. Okay, that's what money often creates, is that ability to control the narrative. The second part of the verse shows one specific way in which the rich rule over the poor, and their power it talks about being manifest in the realm of debt. The borrower is slave to the lender. It's often taken as a warning against borrowing. So in the ancient world, if you were in debt to someone, one way to pay off the loan was to become a slave to that individual until the debt was paid off. In our modern economics, we don't think like that. We don't think in those terms. But when we have a large debt, it sometimes means working longer hours or maybe 2 jobs, effectively becoming a slave to our work. And so there's this caution here from a borrower's perspective. Be cautious about how much debt we load onto our lives. Be cautious about debt. And that's the common application of the verse, and we ought to heed that, all right? The Bible consistently talks about, warns us about debt. Okay? It's not that it's all evil or wrong, but just be cautious about it. But I think in light of the following verses, the warning here is directed not so much at the borrower as it is directed at the lender. I think the warning in this passage is directed more at the lender than the borrower. It is telling the lender to be careful how they exercise their power. not to charge exorbitant interest rates, for example, or to otherwise abuse the poor. And the warning comes in verse 8. Whoever sows injustice reaps calamity, and the rod they wield in fury will be broken. Here's the consequence of the greedy exploitation of the poor. Injustice treats people falsely and unfairly so as to take advantage of them for self-gain. And when we desire riches over a good name, when we're more focused on self-gain than God, when that's our focus, we use our power to get what we want. But we reap what we sow. Right? So sow grass seed, and grass will grow. Sow raspberry plants, and you get raspberries. Sow injustice, and you reap calamity. Sow injustice, and you reap calamity. If we oppress the needy, like the lender exploiting the borrower, then God will bring back on us the calamity that we sought to cause them. God will expose our unbelieving heart. The rod wielded in fury here speaks to the violence that's often used to enforce the abuse of power. And that rod of fury of violence may not just be physical. One pastor warns about how violence shows up in our relationship. He says you don't have to be a hitman or a tribal headhunter to use violence to serve your ambition. You can commit violence to someone's name, reputation, or finances. Violence is a frame of mind before it is physical act. It's an end justifies the means philosophy. You harden your heart to the pain you inflict on others in order to advance yourself. That's the rod of fury. That's the violence that's used to get what we want. And Proverbs calls us to a very different use of power. You will have power in your life in some way or other. And Proverbs calls us to a very different use of that power. Instead of trying to dominate others, we are to use power, whether it comes from money or from status or from reputation or from wherever, whatever power, we're to use it as a means of doing good. And so Proverbs 22 verse 9 says to us, the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. God blesses the generous believer. The word for generous is literally the person with a good eye. And elsewhere in Proverbs, it talks about the greedy having an evil eye. It talks about the stingy having an evil eye. And so the person with a good eye is content. They're caring. And out of that, they share with those in need. That word for share means that the generous person gives from his food. Right? In other words, he gives some of his food. And when we put it like that, Peter Leithart asks this question: why doesn't he give it all away? Why doesn't he give it all away? And he answers the question like this. The picture is of a man eating bread, confronted by a poor man who gives part of his bread to the poor man. And he says, those who have should give to those who don't have, but they give in such a way that they share the goods together. They give in such a way that they share the goods together. There's that's an important aspect of generosity. There's an upcoming book called The Anti-Greed Gospel. The Anti-Greed Gospel. And the writer was asked, why didn't you just call it the generous gospel? And this is his reply. He said, generosity can manifest itself as paternalism, When we think about philanthropy broadly, there's a way of thinking about giving that allows the giver to remain in the seemingly superior position and the receiver remains in a seemingly inferior position. I want to call people to understand that deep solidarity looks like walking alongside people who recognize I have things you need and you have things I need. You see, generosity can just be another way for us to rule over people. Generosity can just be another way for us to control people. And what God calls us to is something very radical, where wise generosity brings people together. As Proverbs 22 verse 2, first part literally says, rich and poor meet together. And that's the challenge. This is such a difficult thing to practice. I feel like I'm just starting to maybe scratch the surface of this a little bit to try and try to articulate and try to figure out what this means and what this looks like. And this is a journey for us, right? This is a journey for us to understand together. What does this mean in terms of helping, right? So that we don't hurt those that we help. The takeaways for me are number one, we need to be generous from a good eye. In other words, it's not just about our actions, but our motives, our desires, our character. Why are we doing what we're doing? And then we want to be as generous as we can. Andrew Kerr says, whatever lengths the summons of kindness calls you to go, you want to go there as quickly as you can and help that downtrodden, impoverished man. So we want to be as generous as we can. And then third, we want to strive to be relational in our giving. Strive to be relational. And like I said, this is such a big area. There is an organization called Tear Fund, TEARFUND, Tear Fund. They have, I believe, on their website, you can sign up for a free 6-video course on the topic of how to help without hurting. How to help without hurting. But just such a big area of thought, and certainly not meant to make us second guess our generosity, but to move us to see God's perspective on how we share what we have. Remember Proverbs chapter 22, verse 1. A good name is more desirable than great riches. Some people want to make a name for themselves by acquiring great riches. That's the name they want to make. Let's be wise. Let's be more committed to gaining a good name. Instead of being driven by the love of money, may we, by God's grace, be generous with what He has given to us. The second area here is that we are to be gracious with our words on wisdom's path. The way we use our words is another distinguishing characteristic of the way of wisdom that leads to a good name. And in particular, Proverbs 22 verse 11 says we are to speak with grace. We are to speak with grace. It doesn't mean that we are people pleasers. It doesn't mean that we always say nice things. To speak with grace means that we speak what is good. We tell what is right and just and fair. Our words give hope and peace. It may include rebuke. It may include warning. It may sometimes be seemingly harsh words, right? But it always seeks the good of the other person. How does that differ from the way we are sometimes tempted to speak? One way is this. Gracious words are not mocking. Gracious words are not mocking. Verse 10. Drive out the mocker, out goes strife, quarrels and insults are ended. You know, my first thought when I came to this verse was to tie it with Proverbs chapter 21, verse 24. It's the page before that. It says, the proud and arrogant person, mocker is his name. All right? The proud and arrogant person is given the name mocker. That's not the kind of name we're to desire. When we stray from the path of gracious words, that's where we end up. We don't end up with a good name, but we become known by our mocking. And in many ways, mocking is again about power, right? We do it to get our way. We do it to push our agenda. We do it to stroke our ego, to prove our superiority. We have cutting, biting words. The mocker looks proudly down on others and schemes to expose their weaknesses, to expose their vulnerabilities. They use quarrels. They use insults to divide people, to shame people. One writer puts it like this: rather than aiming at love or joy, mocking, scoffing shoots for sadness, heartache, or anger. It reduces someone to a punchline. It extorts laughter from unkindness. And the result of that is strife. It's brokenness in the home. It is friendships destroyed. It is churches split. It is workplaces becoming dysfunctional because of mocking. Because we use our cutting words to show how much better we are than the other person. And in contrast to that, verse 11 calls us to be a person who speaks with grace. One who loves a pure heart, who speaks with grace, will have the king for a friend. If our words flow from our hearts as Jesus said, then gracious words flow from a pure heart. Pure heart is a heart devoted to God. Okay, just as pure gold has no alloys, a pure heart has no other gods, no other allegiance than to King Jesus. It is a heart that loves God with all of our being and loves others as ourselves. When we're committed to walking in God's wisdom, what should come out of our mouths are words that seek the good of others. Right? Because our heart is devoted to God. Our allegiance is to Him. Because it's devoted to Him fully. Purely His. So we love others. We love Him with all of our being, and we love each other. And I want you to notice that one of the results of this speaking with grace is that we have the King for a friend. We live in a time when many influencers are biting. They are sarcastic. They are cynical, right? The influencers that many of them on wherever you turn, they use their mocking to gain an audience. But here we see that the person who speaks gracious words is an influencer of kings. It doesn't necessarily mean that you or I will be prominent or that we will be raised to positions of persuasion, but righteous kings, righteous leaders seek the counsel of those who love a pure heart and speak what is good, whose words unite rather than divide. And ultimately, the greatest privilege of a good name, of speaking words of grace, is that we are friends with the King of Kings, with the one who is over all. Secondly, gracious words are not only not mocking, they are not unfaithful. Verse 12, the eyes of the Lord keep watch over knowledge, but he frustrates the words of the unfaithful. When it is for our advantage, we are tempted to distort the truth. When it is to our advantage, we are tempted to go back on our word. When it is to our advantage, we are tempted to exaggerate the situation. When it is to our advantage, we are tempted to make false promises, to talk behind people's back, even to outright lie. Those are unfaithful words. Not only unfaithful to other people, but ultimately unfaithful to God. Keep in mind that God sees all that we say. His eyes roam the earth and guards knowledge or wisdom. It's been said that God is the guarantor. God is the guarantor that the teachings of wisdom will be vindicated. He's the guarantor. Right? So we may ignore, we may distort his wisdom and think we can say whatever we want to get whatever we want. But when we speak unfaithful words, God will ultimately undermine it. He will ultimately undermine it. And then to flip it around, if you are on the receiving end of unfaithful words, if you're on the receiving end of that, have this assurance that the God of the universe, the guarantor, will be faithful to his wisdom, and his truth will prevail. So let me give you two examples of unfaithful words. Found in verse 13 and 14. These two verses touch on two major themes in Proverbs: being faithful in our responsibilities and being faithful in our relationships. And in verse 13, we see the unfaithful words of the sluggard. The sluggard says, "There's a lion outside. I'll be killed in the public square." Now, lions didn't typically roam the streets of the towns in ancient Israel. So this is blatantly absurd. Right? And we understand it. We can sense that even when we read that. But the sluggard or loafer can find the craziest justification for his refusal to work. And so rather than doing what he should to provide for himself and his family and even to help the needy, here he excuses his laziness by exaggerating the danger of going out the door, of going to work. Now listen, there are times when workplaces are truly not safe. I get that. And we should support those who have legitimate reasons why they cannot work. But the sluggard creates phantom risks in order to shirk his responsibilities. God calls us to be diligent. God calls us to be diligent. Not workaholics, but diligent. He calls us not to neglect our God-given responsibilities. And there are times when we truly want to run from that. Right? There are times on a Tuesday morning when I think of what I have to do that day, and I don't want to get out of bed. But the answer is not to fabricate excuses. Far better to cast our anxieties upon Christ. Cast all your cares upon him. And then, as one pastor says, to apply your will to a task in hard work in such a way that as you do it and after you do it, you are sensing and then knowing God is at work in you. By His grace, we want to be faithful in our responsibilities. The other area where we see unfaithful words in this passage is in verse 14, and the unfaithful words of the adulteress. Right? The mouth of an adulterous woman is a deep pit. A man who is under the Lord's wrath falls into it. We've met the adulterous woman before, Proverbs chapter 5 through 7, when Solomon talked about sexual temptations. Her lips drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil, Proverbs 5 verse 3. Her words are seductive, playing on lustful desires, Proverbs chapter 7. If the heart of marriage is faithfulness, right? If the heart of marriage is faithfulness, then adultery attacks the very core of marriage. At the same time, the adulterous woman is also symbolic of all temptation to be spiritually unfaithful to God. And so Proverbs 7 leads into Proverbs 8 and 9, where it talks about the woman folly, enticing us away from wisdom. If we think back to the earlier chapters in Proverbs, we'll recall that the unfaithful words of the adulteress are a deadly trap, right? So in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. Proverbs 5, verses 4 to 5. Many are the victims she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. Proverbs 7, verse 26 to 27. And those are warnings that we're to take to heart, that the way of the adulteress leads us to death. And yet, that's not exactly how Solomon puts it in Proverbs 22. Did you notice that? He did not say that those who fall into the adulterous woman's deep pit are under God's judgment. He didn't say that. He didn't say that the person who falls into the adulterous woman's deep pit are under God's wrath. But he flips it around. He says the person who is under God's wrath, his judgment, fall into the adulterous woman's deep pit. The warning is this: stay faithful to the Lord. Do not so wander away from Him and harden your heart that He gives you over to the deep pit. Do not so wander away from God. Do not so harden your heart against Him that He abandons you to your own way, to fall into the deep pit of the adulterous woman. Pursue a good name. Pursue a good name. Not the name mocker, not the name unfaithful, but speak words of grace, that you might stand in grace when you stand before Jesus. Today, if you are tempted to make a name for yourself, I want you to know that one day King Jesus will have the name that is above every name. If you're tempted today to make a name for yourself, there will come that day when Jesus will have the name that is above every name. And on that day, The name we make for ourselves because we trusted in our hoarded wealth, that name will be nothing. On that day, the name we make for ourselves because we won with our harmful words, that name will be nothing. On that day, the good name that would be honored in the presence of Jesus is the name that reflects him. It's the name that reflects his life. It is the good name that is gained through a spirit-empowered life, generosity and grace. May he help us, right, to be people who are generous. May he help us to be people who are gracious. A good name is to be desired more than anything else. Let's pray. King Jesus, you are the one who sits upon the throne of this world. You see us trying to make a name for ourselves. Like the people of Babel building a tower to the heavens to exalt ourselves. We confess to you that we want to be the God of our lives. We want to be the God over other people. We want to have power, a name so that we can control the narrative, not only of our lives, but the lives of the people around us. And so we come to you today and we ask this, that you would recalibrate our hearts so that we would desire that good name in your presence, that what you think of us matters to us more than anything else, and that you will keep us pursuing that path of wisdom, to be people who are generous, coming alongside, not in any superior way, coming alongside to truly help. We would be gracious. Oh, that we would speak words that bring people together, not divide them apart. Oh, that we would speak those words that don't cut people down. Words that are faithful and true. We look to you and the power that you give by your Spirit to enable us to do that day in and day out for the glory of your name. Amen.